Hey folks, so I've got, I think, all day just riding straight down this highway. It's grey and it's raining and I'm bored, so I figure instead of sitting down to record this stuff, I might give it a go while pedaling, see how well the noise reduction works on the highway that's going on right next to me. I'm on the way to Yellowstone from Ennis at the moment. It's day 20. I haven't quite checked my numbers lately, but I think I've been hitting my average pace just fine, minus the couple days that I took off trying to get everything sorted out back in Vancouver. So since I last did an update, I've cycled from Oliver, BC to Ennis in Montana. Now I'm headed towards the border of Montana, headed to Yellowstone, and then on to Wyoming. Finished BC. I cycled sections of the Trans-Canadian Trail and sections of the Crow's Nest Highway. Trans-Canadian Trail is quite variable in terms of difficulty. Some of it is wonderful, smooth, easy, graded rail trails. Some of it's a bit more bumpy, like I mentioned last week. So I'm trying to follow a bit of a theory of trying to switch between highways and trails just to get a nice balance of getting some speed on the highway so that I'm not pulling 12 to 16 hour days just because the amount of time I'm spending pedaling is blowing everything out. But if you're on the highway all the time, you just get bored and the body gets sore from not being able to move around as much. So I climbed over from Oliver to Christina Lake. On the way, I met my first ever rattlesnake. I guess because I have a bit of experience with snakes in Australia, but this climate's so green and not that warm that I wasn't really looking on the ground for snakes, and I startled one that was on the edge of the trail. So that's the most exciting animal that I've seen so far. I stayed with Bev, Richard and Yogi at Christina Lake. There are a couple of cycle tourists that they like to ride around with their dog Yogi in a trailer. From there I headed over a section of the Trans-Canadian Trail called the Columbia and Western, which is a rail trail, heads through a lot of cool tunnels and quite a lot of climbing. This was the day where the weather really started to pack in, and as I was going up the climb, things turned from little spits of rain to absolute downpours, to the point that you're just cycling up a street rather than up a trail. So not long after that, my Garmin recorded just 2 degrees Celsius, so near freezing in the middle of the day on that mountain pass. It was pretty bad. It's that sort of thing that all the signs in alpine areas warn you about, and because the weather had been so good in BC, I think a lot of us, including me, were lured into a false sense of security because most days were 26 degrees average and sunny. I'd put on my list of things to get the plastic gloves and to find some plastic bags for my feet, and I just hadn't gotten around to it because I'd forgotten that in the mountains the weather can be quite unpredictable, and so I went up the climb with aching toes and aching fingers, and everything started getting extremely wet. Eventually I limped my way to Castlegar, stopped off at the local dumpsters and picked up lots of donuts again, stayed over at the holiday park, and then headed on towards Nelson. Nelson was another day of the rain packing it in again. So I had a short day that day. I decided to stop at the Holt Cyclist Shelter because the rain was just seemed like it would never end, but of course as soon as I stopped it did end. And I wanted to put everything out to try to dry it a little bit and have a rest from the long days of getting late. The Holt Shelter is quite rare. It's a free shelter for cyclists and hikers. Most of the campsites in Canada are really, or at least in BC, are really quite expensive. So it's nice to have a free campsite every once in a while because everything in BC is expensive anyway, and a lot of the campsites are priced as if you're coming with a camper van and 3 friends, not coming with a bike to crash in a small patch of dirt for 6 hours. I also picked up some free plastic bags in Nelson, picked up some dog poop bags from the park, clean ones of course. Won't work for everybody, but I got pretty small feet, so they make for perfect shoe covers. After a little bit of a better rest at the Holt Shelter, I pressed on all the way to Yak, taking the ferry across. So on the other side of the water, things started getting a little bit less mountainous and a little bit more sunny. And I started to run into more and more cycle tourists, where for the last few days it had been mostly me slogging it out by myself and occasionally talking to locals in town. And I started thinking about how I was getting close to the Tour Divide Trail and whether I was going to perhaps catch the tail end of the race, which I thought would be pretty cool because the tail end tends to be pretty social and it's nice to make new friends. So from Yak I headed to Cranbrook, which was a pretty uneventful day on the highway to start off with, but almost as soon as I got into town it started hailing, heaviest hail possibly that I've been in, and I limped myself over to the nearest shelter and eventually decided to call it in Cranbrook for the night rather than go another 40 kilometers up the road to the campsite because everything was dirty, everything was soaked, and with the temperatures that I'd been experiencing, I wasn't convinced that it was safe to keep bikepacking while so wet. After Cranbrook, I had a day to get across the US border, so after a late start to do a bit of the paperwork, I rode around the gravel trails and gravel roads near Lake Koocanusa, which is a portmanteau of Kootenay, Canada and the USA, because it's on the border of Canada and the USA. I don't know, I feel like there is probably a way better Indigenous name for this place, and kind of a little bit disappointed with the Koocanusa, but it was a beautiful place. So towards the evening I managed to make it to the border, and a little bit earlier than I expected I started catching riders from the tour divide, and I quickly learned that the garbage weather that I'd been experiencing over towards the west had also hit the tour divide, and some people had slowed down because the weather was so bad, and some people had taken, I think, the highway from Fernie as well because things were so bad. So got across the border just fine, which was great. The border officers did ask why I seemed so happy when I'd just been through hell, and I said, yeah, I came a different way to everybody else, so it wasn't so bad. So as soon as I crossed the border, it definitely felt like different energy. Montana's quite a Republican state, and I immediately got the vibe of, oh, I probably should be more careful about what I say. So I pressed on to Eureka to camp there. No one else was camping in the park, which turned out to be not much of a surprise because the park didn't seem to have many amenities anymore, so it was just me and a bunch of deer. The next day I decided to ride on to Kalispell, where I was going to stay with Lance and Shelley Jo. Lance works at the local bike shop Whedon's, which is a extremely impressive bike shop with lots of cool stuff in it. Did a bit of riding on the highway and tried my best to get some off-road riding in where I could. Getting stuck a few times because it turns out the United States is covered in signs that say no trespassing and private road and whatnot, and I was finding it really hard to tell whether that was something that would probably be fine for me to cross, or whether I was gonna, bring down the reputation of all bikepackers. So I had a few failed detours, and then eventually I ended up on the old Fort Steele Trail, which meandered over past the lake and a railway line, and it was absolutely beautiful, though full of puddles. Hung out with Lance and Shelley Jo, and they seem very prolific at having guests. So I also met Seth, who had come to stay, who's already spent 3 years cycling around America. I'm always humbled by the generosity of folks that are on warm showers. It was wonderful to have a break from camping. From Kalispell, my sights were set on rejoining the To Divide Trail for a while, and I joined it just after Big Fork, which turned out to be a kind of overpriced touristy place, to be honest, and I deeply regret spending $5 US, which is I think about 8 or 9 New Zealand, on one cinnamon roll, but I really needed the Wi-Fi because I'm only planning a couple days ahead, and so it's important to keep on top of where exactly I'm going and where I'm going to camp. It could turn into a bit of a mess trying to find campsites because sometimes they're not on Google Maps. Sometimes they are, but they're not campsites anymore. It can get really confusing, and the last thing you want is to do a stretch day where you plan to roll into camp at 9 or 10 p.m. and then the camp you roll into is not a camp. Especially in bear country, where if you get there and you're not at a place with bear lockers or rubbish bins that you can put your stuff inside, you need to figure out how to do a proper bear hang if you've got more food than fits in the bear canister, or in my case, frantically eat all of the food that doesn't fit in the bear canister, which, as much as I love food, isn't a lot of fun and has got me in a few messes before. So unfortunately this was one of those days, headed towards Sealy. I thought I was going to stop at a campsite that didn't exist, and I had to push on another 38 kilometres up the road towards Holland Lake. There looked like there was a free campsite, so I decided to push on towards that with the paid campsite as a backup, and I was pleasantly surprised to find not just a great free campsite with a bear locker, but a great group of people, a couple of local families from Holland Lake that invited me to come sit around the fire and hang out for a while. So I'm really grateful for that. From the nearby town of Sealy Lake, the next day was when the Tour Divide bikepacker social life really started to hit. I saw a bunch of riders at Sealy trying to pick up food and get their chores done, and we'd end up seeing each other for a few days straight after that. First riding over to Ovando, and then the next day to the Lone Llama Ranch. Ovando is quite a famous spot on the Tour Divide route. Their hospitality is great. They have free places to camp, a few little free spots to stay in, like a teepee and a covered wagon, and the local jail. And when we got there, they offered to put us up in the basement of the local church, which was very cool of them, and left us cookies and some clean towels and stuff, which was wonderful. There ended up being 10 bikepackers all sleeping together in the church basement, whare style. So after a pretty slow start in Ovando and taking photos and hanging out, the plan was to get to the Lone Llama Ranch. Sometimes people call the Llama Farm. It's a place that has been around for over a decade, and they've been generously hosting Great Divide cyclists for free. There's a bunch of little cabins that you can sleep in, camping, and they keep a fridge out front stocked with sandwiches and free beers. Unfortunately, I missed them because they were headed out to a solstice party and didn't quite manage to scoop a cabin either, so I camped outside with the llamas. That day I joined the Tour Divide route from Lincoln and took the mountain pass over to the Llama Ranch. The mountain pass is epic. Made me very jealous of what the Tour Divide riders were going to do next, and that I was going to have to sludge away on a highway like this one instead. Briefly hanging out in Lincoln to try to have a break from the hot temperatures, and talking to all the locals who insisted that you really should have a gun in bear territory because guns are best. And we said, okay, not wanting to disagree with people who had guns. Most riders are carrying bear spray, and in that part of the trail, what the bears are doing and where the bears are and what to do about bears is definitely the number one topic. We're always talking about bears. Folks also told me stories of the famous Unabomber who was eventually found living in the hills of the mountain pass that we took over to the llama farm. He was famous for a few decades ago sending bombs in the mail and managed to kill a few people. And more recently, his cabin that he hid out in was uplifted and taken to some museum somewhere else. So from the llama farm, it was time to leave the excitement of the trails and slog along the highway for a while, considering that the Tour Divide was headed west for a bit, with a plan to potentially rejoin them in or after Yellowstone when they head east again. Though of course that means I'm getting a pretty significant shortcut, which means that I might not meet my old friends again, but I might find some new ones, so that's not too bad. On my next day, I tried to get pretty quick through Helena, filled with a lot of stroad. So stroad is a combination between a street and a road, generally with the worst features of each. Lots of cars, pretty unpleasant for cycling. So I quickly headed over to the dumpsters, got some free pizza, and then headed out towards Boulder. So there was a couple of encounters I had headed towards Boulder. It was a pretty dull, straight highway next to the interstate, and there wasn't much going on, but temperatures have been getting hotter and hotter. My Garmin was reading 35 degrees C, and the forecast the locals were quoting was 83 degrees Fahrenheit. My water bottles was almost warm enough to brew cups of tea in. It was so hot. So I carried on down the empty highway, and then eventually I was pulled over by the county sheriff, who accused me of wobbling when a car was coming to try to push him out of the way, and that was very confusing to me because that wasn't what I was doing at all. Around here, the police have guns, so I said, "I'm very sorry, I won't do it again," and carried on my way after wobbling offensively in a car's direction. Then I headed on up a road that had a few road closed signs on it, but the only other alternative was a long detour or a ride on the interstate, which I'm pretty sure you're not supposed to do. As I got to the top of a long climb, I was stopped looking at the view, and a pickup truck pulled over and offered me a beer. And as we got to talking, I was talking about heading towards a campsite in Boulder, and Jeff, the driver of the pickup, offered me a place to stay at his house, which was extremely generous. Had a great evening with Jeff and his wife Nancy and their two dogs, Bailey and Reba, and a bunch of goats. So far, I'm not sure what it's like in other states, but I've certainly benefited from Montana's hospitality. After that, I had a big 138-kilometer hit down the highway to Ennis, where I stayed with some Warm Showers hosts, Kevin and Lisa, who are pretty prolific. They had 49 cyclists to stay just last year. With Warm Showers, I try to ask only once a week, just because it's peak season, and I think we all need to share and have opportunities to stay with folks. And I know saying I'm doing a world record makes it pretty compelling to take me, but I want to share with all the other riders as well. And so that's where you find me here, day 20, slogging away down the highway towards Yellowstone. Things that I've learned in the last couple of weeks. There was one moment where I thought I was finally going to meet a bear. I was going up the mountain pass and there was a truck driving slowly with a creature in front of it, and I slowed down and I waited and they moved on. And then eventually I caught up to them again on the trail and found that it was just someone in their pickup truck taking their dog for a walk. And as I asked locals later about this, they said, yeah, it's a thing that people in Montana do. They drive their cars to walk their dogs, which personally I find a bit horrifying. Another big thought I had is about the tour divide. So it definitely feels odd to me to be on it from time to time, because the tour divide is a great route and I've really enjoyed the parts that I've seen, but it's also not any better than lots of the other great bikepacking routes around the world. And I think, especially down in the southern hemisphere, lots of people talk about the Tour Divide as this holy grail ride that they have to go and do, and it's so great. But as much as I've loved it, I haven't loved it more than any of the other bikepacking routes that I've done, like the TA, the Sounds to Sounds, the Pico, Hunt 1000, or even just casual bikepacking. And so I often think that it's just better to appreciate the stuff that you've got at home first before rushing off to something like the Tour Divide, where, especially if you're a beginner, if you need a scratch from the Tour Divide, which many people have this year, it's such a huge cost just to get to the start line that sometimes folks get too wrapped up in the hype. And yeah, certainly for me, I wanted to make sure that I'd done pretty much everything back home first that I could do and seen pretty much everything before I let myself go off to faraway places to try their stuff as well. It's better for the environment, and it's often better for your enjoyment of bikepacking too. And yeah, that's it. Recording this video has helped me pass 20 kilometers of boring highway, so that's pretty nice. I'm not sure how good it's going to be, but I guess I'm just trying out a bunch of different things right now to see what's the best combination of time efficient, interesting, yeah, not too laborious, because I need to spend my time pedaling, not just filming. So yeah, we'll see how we go, and I'll catch you next time.